Okay, so hi, Mahalakshmi and Aranyani. We will do this interview for the first Congress, Latin American and Argentinian Congress of Indian Classical Dance. And so we've made a short list, not that short, a long list actually of questions to go to some of the topics that we find very important related to the history of dance. The subject is the importance of studying the history of dance. So with this list of questions, we hope that we can go through many of the most important topics on this subject. But if you think that there's something left out and you want to add something, obviously you're welcome. So welcome, Mahalakshmi and Aranyani. I'm very thankful. We are very thankful that you've joined us. So I will ask you to introduce yourselves to start with.
So I go first. Okay. Namaskaram. Good evening, good morning. My name is Mahalakshmi Prabhakar. I'm a Bharatanatyam dancer based in Delhi currently. Growing up, I was in Chennai where I learned Bharatanatyam from Sri N. Selvam, who was the Natuvana of Indra Rajan, Guru Indra Rajan. After which I learned under his student Ratnamala. Later, I moved to Coimbatore, where I studied Bharatanatyam more seriously under Srimati Lavanya Shankar, who is a student of Guru K.J. Sarsa. And it was during these years that I really started looking at dance and very, very seriously. And about my path in dance, I've had a very humble path. I've not had performances in very illustrious sabhas or coveted sabhas, but I have consistently been involved with various aspects of dance going beyond performance. While I have performed all over India, but my interest in dance is not limited to dance performance itself. So that is about me.
Hi, namaskar. My name is Aranya Bhargav. I started training at the age of 5 with Leela Samson, and I did that for 15, 16 years. And after that, as I was entering college, I started to dig up dance history just out of curiosity and interest. And there was a combination of a disillusionment with the way Bharatanatyam was being, practiced and presented, and also just a host of things, that the knowledge about the Devadasi history and all of that, it kind of took me away from Bharatanatyam for a while. I did contemporary dance, I did archival work, I did academic work, I wrote a thesis, a master's thesis on Bharatanatyam, and but finally I was drawn right back to Bharatanatyam. And so I performed solo quite a lot in India and abroad. I started a dance company called Vyuti, and so that's mainly been my path. It went my solo dance continues, but I also formed a group called Vyuti, which I wanted to start to kind of question the existing accepted norms in Bharatanatyam. And I teach, and of course our latest endeavor with Mahalakshmi and me together is recognizing dance. So sorry, re-cognising dance. I always say it wrong. So that's my path.
Oh, great. Thanks a lot. That's both very interesting slides. So how did you get interested in dance history? Why do you think you get that interest?
So everything about dance fascinates me. Not just like I already said, it's not just performance and the technique. I also had a brief stint of being a research scientist in Singapore, working as a biophysics researcher. My academic experiences taught me that art has to be looked at holistically, and you need an interdisciplinary approach to dance itself, even something like an art and dance especially. And it was almost 10 years ago that I started my college years. I started getting very involved and I started reading everything I find about dance. And when I found and I found my calling for academics in dance, and the social history of dance like immediately drew me into it. And like Aranyani said, I went through a phase of being extremely disillusioned. I stopped performing for a brief while. I started questioning because there was so much spoken about marginalization, appropriation, and so on. And I was also uncomfortable about what I thought was Bharatanatyam was probably not what Bharatanatyam was supposed to be. And these questions kept me very engaged. And that got me, looking for answers. But now I'm back performing, teaching Bharatanatyam, and I'm very happy now doing Bharatanatyam. But I am happy I took that break as well, because it gave me these answers, gave me the context, and now I'm more motivated than ever. So I just started reading, and I was immediately drawn to dance history.
Well, for me, actually, what Maha said, it really resonates with me as well, because I think exactly what you said about what I thought was Bharatanatyam was maybe not what Bharatanatyam was. And that discovery came with the discovery of Bharatanatyam's history. And I chanced upon this history, like I said, very accidentally. It wasn't taught to me as part of my training as a dancer. And once I did find out about the Devadasi history, I realized that it completely changed the way that I viewed Bharatanatyam as a dance form, how I internalized it into my own practice, how I understood the current politics of it and everything. So that's what got me interested in studying dance history.
Oh, great. Thank you. I think many of us who are here asked ourselves the same questions that you're asking yourselves, and well, that's nice. So I wanted to ask you if you think that studying dance history is important for dancers and dance students.
I go first. So I think understanding dance history is very, very important. More because today we are performing it out of context, it's been resituated. Dance was, it was originally Bharatanatyam was had a different purpose, different. It was for different locations for different people, and this understanding of history gives you that context. I also makes you sensitive, empathetic dancer. It gives you a certain kind of emotional intelligence to be sensitive. And for me, I'd like to add even lessons in, say, Natya Shastra, Abhinay Darpana, all the texts that we're talking about, they are as much dance history as they are of aesthetics, or, because this kind of talk tells you about how people thought of culture, how people thought of art. So dance history is huge. And I think everything that comes under theory, technique, everything is history. And what we are performing is something that is extremely historical and but also constantly evolving. But for me, my approach to dance itself changed when I started understanding history. For example, I became more sensitive to music because I understood how important it was for the hereditary dancers. Music, how sensitive they were to the music and musicality and compositions, and that kind of changed even my taste in music. What I would like to perform to and I would not like to perform to. And of course, like I said, it gives you that context. And after I studied dance, now I can't say I've studied, but once I began studying dance history, I'm more motivated than ever, right? And but also, most importantly, for students of dance, I believe we all need to have an interdisciplinary approach, and we need to study history, one, for the pure joy of knowledge, and also preserving cultural memory. it's important for our cultural memory.
I mean, I fully agree with what Maha is saying. Just to add to it, I of course agree that yes, of course, it's important to study dance history. And I think all I'd like to say is that when we are practicing an art form, then a lot of people say it becomes a part of who you are, and asking whether if dance history is important or not, or why is dance history important, that to me is like asking why you should know who you are. It's anything that you do, and particularly with a dance form with such a complex history, you are not just a dancer, you are a participant in a long tradition. You don't just start to dance and you become a set of you become a part of a set of practices in history. How can you not study this? We must know where we are coming from, or where our dance form is coming from, and what opportunities we have along the way to give it a future. So in order to do that, you have to study the past. So that's what I'd like to add.
Wow, thank you. Such a great insight, and thank you. Beginning with the history of dance, we all learned that the origin of Bharatanatyam can be found in the Natya Shastra. But now we are particularly interested in the actors, the dancers, the people who danced. So the dancing subjects, so to say. So who could you say were the first dancers that we can relate to what we now call Bharatanatyam?
Anna, for this, actually, I have started my answer with why is dance history not from the Natya Shastra? Why we should not believe in that? Is that okay? Do you want to read?
Yes, that's perfect. The point I wanted to make is that when we start studying dance, the first lesson of all is, well, we can find the origin of Bharatanatyam in the Natya Shastra, and I think that's what we want to talk about. Yes, that's great, Maha.
Okay. So Indian dance and its origins are traced to a number of documents and textual sources, the Natya Shastra, Sangeeta Ratnakara, Abhinay Darpana, and so on. Natya Shastra has taken precedence over all these because of its extensive nature. It's an extensive document it's an extensive treatise with so much of information about all of dramaturgy. Whereas Abhinay Darpana is a document that deals specifically with only dance, and Natya Shastra is so extensive, and it immediately has taken precedence over all the other texts. But all these texts, when you think of text and textual sources, they provide you ways to think about dance, they codify dance, they record dance, and they teach you probably how to analyze dance, like the Bhava Rasa theory. These are verbal descriptions of art, right? And the history of Natya Shastra itself is interesting, right? Because Natya Shastra, as we all study, we say it's 2000 odd years old, but any document of that time and age, you cannot pinpoint to a single year or a single time frame. That itself would be scientifically and chronologically wrong. What we can do is say it is probably in and around another text with respect to a reference point. So to say, to provide Natya Shastra itself an exact date is not really accurate. And also, our understanding of Natya Shastra is a lot from 11th century text written by Abhinavagupta, right? So Natya Shastra is probably 2000 years old, and 1000 years later, Abhinavagupta has written a commentary, which happens to be a lot of our source for understanding Natya Shastra. But the most important part for us to understand here was the Natya Shastra was rediscovered only in the 1800s, in the 1870s. Now, before 1870s, there was dance happening. So dance was happening before the Natya Shastra, probably during the Natya Shastra, after the Natya Shastra. And Natya Shastra itself was discovered, rediscovered, and written by a German scholar in 1800s, right? And this gave birth to a whole field of Indology, and a lot of people were attracted to the philosophical, spiritual, and religious nature of the Natya Shastra. And as we all also know, Natya Shastra has a very interesting mythological component. So Natya Shastra is partly historical and partly mythological. So like the story we know of is that Brahma gave handed down Natya Shastra to Bharata, and Bharata wrote the Natya Shastra and things like that, right? So there is a significant mythological component, and the accuracy of that is not something that we can verify. So based on what I said, it's not possible for us to give a date and a textual source to dance, because dance would have existed as long as humans exist, right? So what happened is, during the colonial rule and during the revival and reform movements, Indian artists and Indian art connoisseurs and spectators were very attracted to these Hindu roots, these spiritual roots. And this kind of dictated what history of dance was written and spoken about and taught. I'm not here to say Natya Shastra does not exist, or Natya Shastra is very much a part of dance history, but it is not all of dance history. And it is not, you cannot date dance to a single document, is what I'm saying. And the next part of your question about who would we say are the first dancers, I think I don't have a clear answer to that. I firmly believe dance would have existed forever, before the Natya Shastra and after. But if we're talking about the Devadasis dance and the dance, it started with the Chola rule between 9th and 12th centuries in Tamil Nadu, because the Cholas were great patrons of arts. And it was around this time that temple rituals and temple protocols were beginning to be codified. So around this time, dance as a ritualistic performance must have begun. Also, etymologically, Chola inscriptions have this term Devaradiyal, which is very related to the term Devadasi and servant of God. So that is also evidence for us to give that the system would have probably started then. There was Dr. Saskia Kirsenboom's book also mentions that there were Devadasis before the Chola period, but whether they were not in the temple and the ritual context, right? So that's about.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, Anna, you want to add something? Of course.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what Maha was saying about the Natya Shastra, since we were talking about it. Just a small little anecdote that I remembered reading. In Richard Steckner's essay Rasa Aesthetics, that was written in 1988, he actually implies that the author, Bharata Muni, is himself a myth, almost certainly a pseudonym for a collective oral tradition, which basically implies that the Natya Shastra may not have been written by this one person called Bharata Muni, but may have actually been written over a long period of time by many, many people, as and when they kind of came back to, somebody came and wrote something, then a couple of 100 years later, somebody came and wrote something else. So I thought that was an interesting thing to also add to this.
Something else, can I? Related to that. So Tamil scholars and in Tamil Nadu often mention about another document called Kuttanul. Kuttu in Tamil means dance, which is as old as probably the Natya Shastra or even older, which is again a treatise, extensive treatise on dance. Again, other Tamil literary texts such from the Sangam period, it's also 2000 years old, and the texts like the Tolkappiyam have their own Bhavarasa theory and detailed analysis of art. So it's very, that is also contested, where, to say that Natya Shastra was a single point origin can also be challenged by the existence of a parallel document which existed in the Tamil culture. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Thanks a lot. So about the dancers, how did their social background change along history? And what about the social status, the recognition of art, and particularly of dance performance? How did it change along the history of India?
Okay, so for this, the first thing I want to say is social status of arts, past or present, depends on the patronage of arts. So it absolutely, art is for spectators, and it completely depends on the patronage. Uh, like I already said, the organized structure of Devadasi system and dance history that we know of probably has its origins during the Chola period. And Cholas were great patrons of art, and there are inscriptions which mention that the kings brought in around 1000 AD, they brought 400 dancers to Tanjavur, to the temple, to transfer from different temples to the Tanjavur temple. So Tanjavur became this epicenter of Bharatanatyam and dance history, all of dance history that I study, or we speak of, not dance history, but Bharatanatyam has a lot to do with Tanjavur, the temple, the palace, and so on, right? But dancers added prestige to the king. Artists were considered to be adornments for the kingdom. And also, dancers attracted visitors to temple. So having quality dancers and quality, uh, you know, performers for the temple was a very, very important part of the temple. And Devadasi women were held during these periods in very high esteem. They were very, very respected. Some of the anecdotes I've heard, I've read are the Devadasi women were allowed to chew betel leaves in front of the king. Others did not have the honor or the rights to do it. That implies the stature these women had, right? Gods in temples had to mourn the death of a Devadasi. So this is the kind of power and respect that our dancing ancestors of the temple had. And likewise, uh, after the Cholas, there were Nayaks in the Tanjavur belt who were great patrons of art, like once again, and then the Maratha rule, who were also great patrons of art. Uh, what the changes that probably began with colonial rule. But even during colonial rule, what happens is there are scholars who say that once the kings had very little control and power over their kingdoms, they started focusing on arts. So there was a period even during colonial rules where kings patronized and abundantly sponsored and gave to the arts, right? But it was then later with uh, the colonial rule taking a role in the judiciary and Indian elite having, with Western education, placing moral judgments, that the patronage and the attitudes towards these dancers changed. Also, I would like to say that I read recently that dancers migrated even before these contested reform revival movements to the cities, even much before these movements began, right? The migration did start. So once these migrations started, it gave birth to a new kind of patronage where there were zamindars, there were local patrons, and there were local rich elite patrons, the Mudalayars, and so on, the other communities. Now, with these kind of patrons, there was a different kind of patronage, and I think it is during these times that dance uh, can be called as a profession, right? For the temple ritual Devadasis, it was what is called a vritti, a murai. It was the way of life. They were they dedicated themselves for the service of the temple. And it was a way of life. And art was a part of their duty, not all of it, right? So, so that is when I think, when the migration to the cities happened, is when I think you can call dance as probably a profession, but with the Devadasi system, although they were patronized, they were given a lot of iman, they were given a lot of money, they were given land, it was still not really what we know of today in today's uh, understanding of dance as a profession. Yeah. Aranya, you want to add something?
Yes, great. Thank you, Aranyani. Do you want to add something? Oh, you're muted.
You're muted as always.
As always. Yeah, no, I was just going to say that no, I think Maha's got it covered.
Okay.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yes, that was a lot of information. So you've already started talking about the Devadasis and the hereditary dances. So I wanted to ask you about them, especially because some present them as free and powerful women. Some others present them as slaves, even as prostitutes. So these categories are probably all wrong and not that easy to apply to them. It's probably useless trying to label them according to these categories. So maybe a form of approaching the subject was to understand what their life was like, what was their position in society and in arts.
Yeah. So part of this answer, I think I've already given an elaborate answer, but it's okay. For this question, one of the first thing that I want to bring to notice is a very contested issue, is that the term Devadasi itself, I think we think of is an umbrella term. It has a lot of different kinds of sects within this umbrella community of the Devadasis. All the different sects were probably ritually dedicated and so on, but each of them had different roles in the rituals and different purpose in rituals. The Devadasis that we as artists talk about are the hereditary singer dancers, and also that uh, this this group of people are what we know of today as the Isai Vellalar community, right? But the Devadasi also is very often confused for a caste. It is not a caste, it's a community from where who could be recruited from different communities. Not any community, but a certain set of, again, upper caste community. Like I already said, they were very, very auspicious women. They were held in the society with a lot of respect. And they're also known with the term Nitya Sumangali, which means they are ever auspicious because they are married to the god, to the patron deity they are married to. And there is, they were always auspicious, and having these women around was considered sacred. They were synonymous to vitality, abundance, all the positivity, and they were also considered the important forces in society to fight evil, right? So this, all of these factors, because of all of this, they were held in really, really a high esteem and prestige, right? For the Devadasi to be, there is an elaborate process, and the Devadasis are not completely hereditary. There was a recruitment aspect also. So there was a largely a hereditary component, and there's a small component where they could be recruited from other communities. And the hereditary did not always mean they could be dedicated to a temple, because they had to go through a ritual, an application process, just like we would apply for any job. They had an elaborate application process, and they needed, so this is what I meant when there is a hereditary component, and then there is a component of technical virtuosity, right? They had to be technically proficient uh, uh, to be in the temple and to carry out these rituals and functions in the temple. And following this, the temple dedication protocol was also very elaborate. If you all read Dr. Saskia Kirstenboom's book, she refers to a 6-step protocol of how Devadasis were dedicated for ritual service and dedication to temple. And the whole process took like almost 6 odd months from application to getting actually dedicated, right? And so after this, the dedication ceremony itself is a very elaborate ritual marriage, which was very similar to an upper caste Brahmin ritual of marriage. So that again reiterates that Devadasis were held with so much esteem, and they were considered really important to the society. After the dedication was sponsored and the cost was met by a patron. And this patron was chosen by the Devadasi's mother or grandmother. Now, this is a matrilineal household. These women are independent, financially independent, and they take their decisions. There is no male of the Devadasi family taking a decision. So there is the oldest woman of the Devadasi household who takes important financial and these decisions. So she chooses the patron who will sponsor her ritual dedication. And this patron had could avail sexual favors from the Devadasi. So, but the Devadasi in turn did not have to be married to him because she was already married to God, and she did not have to serve him as a wife would to her husband, right? And likewise, the children could not, her children could not claim rights over his property or any of his money, right? But this was an understood deal. But this has often been misunderstood for sexual freedom. And, the Devadasi women, as we know of today, are not fallen women as much as, they were, over the years, yes, we do recognize there was exploitation. There were different points in which there was exploitation of these women, which led to the problems and the questions that the reformers asked, such as getting minors married and so on. We do recognize that this is a gray area, but the Devadasi themselves were not fallen women or women of dishonor. And that our understanding, our current moral values have led us to feel that they were dishonorable, and that stigma still persists. But back in the day, they were very, very honorable women with a lot of economic and financial freedom, and also that they could choose their partner. Aranya, you want to add something?
Great, thank you. Yes, that was a very, clear, so to say, clear answer to such a difficult subject. Aranyani, I don't know if you want to add something.
Just a tiny bit, just to answer the question about the statement, these categories are probably useless for labeling them. Yes, I would say they are definitely useless in labeling them, because the categories are so absolute. You're either free and powerful, or you're a slave or a prostitute. And none of these categories fully explain the comprehensive and very complex role that Devadasis played in polity, in society, in culture. Yes, to a certain extent, they were free and powerful in terms of them being free from domesticated roles, and they had say in political matters sometimes, and all of that. But yes, it's also true that in some instances they were vulnerable to abuse, and they did function after all under the larger patriarchal setup in India. But of course, that doesn't make them slaves or prostitutes. So definitely, it's useless to label them in these ways, for sure. That's what I wanted
to label them in these ways, and it's unfair to understand this in today's with today's moral judgments and
Absolutely. I mean, even monogamy is something that is that you cannot judge monogamy from from today's standards, given the fact that just maybe a few hundred years ago monogamy was not the norm at all. So how can you judge somebody for not being in a monogamous relationship when monogamy was not a big deal at all in that society or in that time?
Yeah, yeah, sure. Yes, absolute categories are always useless in the end. So, thank you. So, following with the life of these women, I would like to ask you when and why did their lifestyle started to change and be questioned, and how did this affect their lives, and if we can relate this to the history of the country and its colonial past.
Okay, so there is a lot of debate around the question of when the lifestyle of the Devadasi women began to be questioned, and but I think the anti-Notch movement is definitely a very significant moment in history as far as this question is concerned. I mean, in the late 1800s, the stirrings of the anti-Notch were already underway, and there are different theories on how this affected their lives, though. I'm giving this information from a couple of people who I spoke to, who have actually directly been in touch with women from hereditary dance communities. So some say that the anti-Notch movement itself was very devastating for the livelihood of the hereditary courtesan dancers. Others say that it was the Madras anti-dedication, the Devadasi Act of 1947 that really, put the final nail in the coffin as far as their livelihoods were concerned. Still, others will say that it was much later during Indira Gandhi's, rule in the 70s that their lives were really, really adversely impacted because of some of her policies. And I think that just tells us that there's no one absolute truth here, because there are multiple truths and multiple lived experiences, and it comes back to the same point that Mahalakshmi was making about all the Devadasis being clubbed into one umbrella term, but actually them being such a heterogeneous lot. But of course, how the unfavorable outlook towards their lifestyle affected their lives is there for everyone to see. In terms, and I'm talking about the dancing, the singer dancer communities. There are barely any Devadasis dancing today. The abolition of dedication to temples affected the lives of many other women as well, though, and these are women from other communities who are all clubbed together into this term. And Maha has already mentioned this, but I want to reiterate this point because it's led to a lot of damage to this discourse in the past, and this is the fact that we don't understand the term Devadasi properly, or we don't bother to listen to what people are saying when they're talking about Devadasis. It's because this term is such a problematized term. It's very important to make the distinction between the Devadasis that we refer to when we talk in the context of dance, and the Devadasis that are talked about in other contexts, such as caste politics and so on. This lack of distinction has led to a huge amount of misinterpretation and a lack of understanding on both dance history as well as the history of Devadasis in general. And like I said before, the Devadasis are not a homogenous lot of women. Devadasis from different regions do not have the same lived experiences or practices or rituals. A Devadasi dedicated to the goddess Yelama in Karnataka was not the same as a Devadasi dedicated in Tiruvarur in Tamil Nadu, for example. Now, as far as the colonial past is concerned, this also is a very complex question. Just as everything about this history is complex, actually. The degree to which colonialism was responsible for the disenfranchisement of the dancing Devadasis is also contested. In my view, colonialism did play a role in their disenfranchisement, because because colonialism is what led to the the nationalist movement, and that was largely led by upper caste Indians and also by nationalistic sentiment that was desperately seeking a proud, distinctively Indian identity in the wake of independence. And so these Indian leaders were hell-bent on proving to their colonizers that they are sophisticated, they are Western educated, they are civilized, and they don't need to be under colonial rule. And this meant, for some reason, distancing themselves from various practices, and that included the Devadasi system, which did involve magical realism as well as non-conjugal relationships, neither of which fit into this modern Indian nationalist idea of India. I have to say that it's important to say that I'm not blaming the British for this. This is something that I've been accused of doing in the past, but I'm not absolving them entirely either. I think it's something that you have to see. There's a gray area there. Having said that, the primary responsibility of the disenfranchisement of the Devadasis lies squarely with the Indians and the Indian leaders who were leading India into independence. These are the Indians who saw themselves as the leaders in terms of politics, society, and culture. So, of course, they played a huge role in this formation of India as a nation for the first time. And so I'll end by saying that it is interesting, however, to remember that the Devadasis underwent tremendous scrutiny and stigma and ostracization for things that very much still exist in society today. Dedication of young girls still continues, dance still continues, private gatherings where raunchy dances happen still continue, dance bars still exist in India. The male gaze is still a very, very big problem. Women are not safe in this country. And we are definitely still a superstitious country that believes in, the dispelling of the evil eye. We all have aunts who, will do these rituals for us. So why were we so against the Devadasis existing? They represented all or at least some of these things, or they were supposedly representing these things. I don't know if that answers your question.
So,
yes, I think so, definitely. But I don't know if Maha wants to add something.
Yeah.
I just want to I pick out one of the sentences, lines from Saskia Kirstenboom's book, which really impacted me and summarizes what Aranyani just said. She says the anti-Notch, anti-Devadasi movement eliminated the most prominent class of Nitya Sumangalis, but the basic cultural motivation exists to date. And I think that beautifully summarizes what Aranyani said.
Right.
But if you were to point out some specific dates, the 1947 was when the bill was actually passed, but the agitation began much before, and as early as 1920s, there was a bill that passed which prevented minors from being dedicated in temples. So, but there was still back behind the door ceremonies where minors were dedicated, but there was a law passed.
And still are.
And still are. And again, 1927, I think, is when Muthulakshmi Reddy started spearheading this movement and took it further. But it started much before the actual, 1927 is when Muthulakshmi Reddy started, being actively involved. But even before that, the motivations for anti-Notch began. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you both. So following with the history, so to say, what can you tell us about the revival movement and the narrative about the origins of Bharatanatyam? And related to this, I think the question about cultural appropriation is really interesting, given most of Latin American Indian classical dancers are not Indian. We're just Latin Americans studying Indian dance.
Yeah. Okay. So this is also a multi-layered question, and so my answer is going to be long. So I apologize in advance. But let me just start with the question of revival. I'm not very comfortable with the term revival, to be honest. I mean, I think you revive something that is dying. I'm not very clear from everything that I've read about whether the dance form was dying or whether that culture was unwittingly killed. And I think it's quite difficult to say with absolute certainty that the dance form would not have survived had it not been rescued. We just don't know what would have happened had the revival movement not happened. So that's why I don't know if revive is actually an appropriate word to use. And I don't think that that the Devadasi dance was revived. In the period of so-called revival, I think instead that a modern dance form was created, and we know it now as Bharatanatyam. I mean, the term itself is not new. It's not a 1930s term. There are Bharatnatya and Bharatnatyam were terms that were used earlier as well. But I'm saying the dance form that we now call Bharatnatyam is, in my opinion, a modern dance form. So it's not a revived old dance form or anything like that. In my opinion, it has clear, visible links to the Devadasi dance in some ways, but in other ways, it is almost entirely severed from it. It is performed in a totally different setting. Maha's already mentioned this. Now it is performed on the proscenium stage. It's not performed in a temple or a court or even a private gathering. It is performed by an entirely different class of people, upper caste, upper class people, elite people, and it is performed for an entirely different function and purpose. There's no ritualistic function anymore to what it was during the time that it was performed by the Devdasis. And I just like to say here that I'm not being critical of modern Bharatanatyam or saying that modern Bharatanatyam is not valuable or useful. I'm a practitioner of it. I adore it. I'm just saying that what I perform is not a revived Devadasi dance form, but rather a modern creation for the reasons I mentioned above. The history of Bharatanatyam was certainly reimagined, though, and that's where these narratives of the origins come from. The whole story about Shiva and how he discovered Bharatanatyam, and then he passed it on to the rishis, and then the rishis handed it over to people like us, and the links with the Natya Shastra, the mythical origins. I feel that they're all just ways of avoiding talking about the history of Bharatanatyam that involves this rather uncomfortable truth of marginalization and displacement of hereditary custodians of the classical dance forms. Now, the question of cultural appropriation. This is a term that I think is used today without being understood adequately. It's a favorite term to be used in discourses today, but it is such a complex and layered term. The more I think about it and observe the way that it is used in discourses today, the more I'm convinced that it's used callously and without understanding. I'm still trying to work out, for example, how anyone in our generation can be suitably accused of cultural appropriation of Bharatnatyam unless we see Bharatnatyam as an object that is owned by someone or by one community of people. I don't know if a culture can be owned by one person, and I certainly do believe that cultures should be shared. There's only something to be gained from the sharing of culture, as long as there is acknowledgement. So, I mean, you mentioned that there are so many Latin American dancers who perform Indian dance, classical dance, and they are not Indian. So what? As long as you're not calling Bharatanatyam or Odissi Latin American classical dance or distorting its history or its origin, I don't see how you're harming anyone by practicing or performing India's dance forms. If everyone who wanted to learn something from another culture was to be accused of cultural appropriation, then we'd be living in a very sad, isolated, and myopic world. I learned ballet, I learned contemporary dance, I learned tap dance to some point. I would love to learn the tango, for example. Would you say that I'm appropriating your culture if I did? There is a difference between cultural appropriation and appreciation. And also, India is a culture, is a country of immense diversity. We are constantly adapting practices of different subcultures of the subcontinent into our own. I mean, if you look at just my example, I'm a North Indian, half Hindu, half Sikh, who calls her father Abba, and Abba is the term for father amongst Muslims, and it's an Urdu term. I practice Bharatnatyam, which is a South Indian form. I am not South Indian. I routinely cook dosas and tomato chutney on one day, which is a South Indian dish, and Thai chicken curry on another day. So if we look at appropriation in such a narrow way, and use it as a weapon to alienate instead of appreciate subcultures, then life is fraught with appropriation. As far in my case, Muslim words, South Indian practices, non-Indian food habits. I mean, appropriation it happens when you steal a cultural practice without permission. You don't properly acknowledge the origin of that culture. You don't bother to properly understand it, and you somehow unwittingly or wittingly disrespect it. When we spoke earlier about imagined narratives, for example, about Bharatnatyam's origins, I do believe that would result in cultural appropriation, because it involves the erasure of hereditary artists by saying Shiva, Nataraja, Bharata Muni, Natya Shastra, and not coming to the real history, which involves, and kind of washing over this entire period as a corrupt period of decline under the Devadasis. Yes, when you go with that narrative, then you are definitely guilty of cultural appropriation. But and we are in some ways, without even realizing it, guilty of appropriation in some form. All of us are. But to say that everyone practicing Bharatnatyam who is not from a hereditary dance community lineage is appropriating the dance form, to me, is a bit of an overstatement. And we don't have time to go into more detail, but I will say this, that I think the question of cultural appropriation in the context of Bharatnatyam, it needs serious study and much deeper understanding before this term is so brazenly used as a weapon.
Great, thank you, Aranyani. Very clear. And Maha, I don't know if you want to add something or just leave it there. Okay. So you started speaking about the relation between present Bharatanatyam and that dance performed by the Devadasis. And I want you to ask you something, to speak us a bit more about that. And in particular, what are aspects that have been lost, and for example, sexual aspects of the dance, or the characters, or items in general. How do you see this?
Well, I mean, you can definitely see the imprint of the dance of the Devadasis on modern day Bharatnatyam. That's why it's even more absurd to not acknowledge their role in Bharatnatyam's history. Even if you look at just the Alaripu, you can see how it's evolved from the time that it was performed. Uh, that dance was performed in the temple, in the courts. The way that even just from YouTube, if you search search for Devadasi performance of the Alaripu, and then you see Bala Saraswati's Alaripu, and you see the present day Alaripu, you can see that natural progression. You can see the imprint of the dance of the Devadasis, for sure. And I think many of the pieces like Shabdams like Sarasi Jakshulu and many Varnams come directly from the Devadasi repertoire. Although some of them have been modified. In some cases, the Tanjore Quartet, the famous four brothers who kind of gave Bharatnatyam its modern day margam and structure, they are also from Devadasi. They are also from the Devadasi community, the hereditary dance communities. They are the Natuvnas. So there is a direct link there as well. But of course, several aspects have also been lost. I think, as Maha and I have already mentioned a bunch of times, the ritual function is completely gone. The function is entirely different today. I think a lot of the sensual, within quote, sensual repertoire has also been lost. And bhakti and shringara, devotion and sensuality, between which I think a differentiation arguably didn't exist when Devadasis were custodians of the art form, are now very distinct categories in dance. So in that sense, the dance repertoire is a bit dismembered, strictly in the sense that when once upon a time one piece could embody both bhakti and shringara, it could have devotion, sexuality, sensuality, spirituality all at once. Today we classify pieces into either a bhakti piece or a shringara piece, and even within shringara there are rules about how much shringara is too much. So of course these aspects have been lost. I mean, recently we were having a discussion about certain javalis that are performed, and whether whether it's appropriate to perform them in this setting or that setting. And so yeah, that debate is definitely something that started after the reconstruction of Bharatanatyam, and it continues till today. And it was not a debate at all. I mean, it was not something that was a dichotomy in the brain of the Devadasis at all. Maha, do you want to say something? You want to add something to this?
Yeah, I want to add a few more things. One, uh, because it was there was a significant ritual repertoire. Let's say let's say the kautvams, they were very simple because they had a ritualistic purpose. They weren't probably, the number of repetitions weren't as many as the number of times we would do it. They were very simple, and the adavus that were done, because it had a very ritual. It had a purpose and a duty. Whereas now on stage, we want to beautify, we want to show our prowess, and we have so many things to prove to an audience, right? That was different. So there was a certain simplicity in their repertoire, which was not like, at least in the ritual aspects. The other thing that I really, really want to add here is, again, when I say Bharatanatyam, I go back to Tanjore, because Tanjore happens to, definitely a lot of history we talk about is in and around the Tanjore district, right? So again, here it's a Tanjore was ruled by the Cholas, who had Tamil as their court language, then the Nayakas, who had Telugu as their court language, and then the Marathas, who did not remove Telugu from court language but added more languages to the court, right? So all these languages and influences, by the time the Tanjore quartet and during the Maratha rule, it was very ripe and fertile artistically. It was extremely multicultural, multilingual. So it is very interesting how in the past they absorbed influences. There is evidence of Persian influence in dance. And even like by the time the Marathas came, it was like a literary corpus being added, and it was a collection of such rich literature. There was even the term Sadir, which is historically or I mean, which was once which the term used to describe the dance earlier. We don't know whether it's a Marathi word. Some say Sadar, Urdu, some say Telugu, because Chaduru. So there are so many. It is interesting, and the very word, it starts at that, the nature, the multilingual nature of the dance. I mean, of course, today we do perform, say, Sanskrit compositions, Tamil, Telugu, but the way they immediately took to English music, because the king, Maratha ruler, was heavily influenced by European culture and music. And there are evidences of, I've read literature which says there was clarinet, which was a part of the Chinnamelam. Chinnamelam is the orchestra for dance, and there was clarinet. And they were very ready and willing to absorb all these influences. And the genre of compositions were also quite different. Of course, we retained the Margam, but we've also eliminated a lot from the Margam.
Yeah,
right, for our convenience of staging. And even there were like yakshaganas, prabandhas, there were whole dance dramas, Kuravanji natakams. Of course, we have revived and we do stage these things in isolation here and there, but we have lost a lot of the multicultural aspects of the history, is what I would like to add.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Maha. So Coming to the present day and the present debates, I would like you to tell us a little bit about the present debate on hereditary dances communities nowadays and the anti-notch movement and the so-called revival movement.
Yeah. So I think the present debate is an extremely important one, because I think for several years uh, these debates didn't take place so openly. And I also think that because of these present debates, the status quo is being shaken up a bit, and marginalized voices are finally being heard, and people are talking about acknowledgement and reparation and so on. Uh, but at the same time, I have to say that at the moment, and maybe this is just a natural first step in a debate such as this, but right now it's quite a mess. There is a massive divide in the dance world in India, and I think perhaps even outside of it. There is one side that is constantly making excuses for appropriation. That did take place in some form in the past, although I would not use that word for it. And they cannot see any shortcomings or any limitations in the movements of the past, or in that history, and in the journey that has led Bharatanatyam to become what it is today. There's always excuses for why things happened the way that they did. Then there's the other side that totally vilifies the movements and the participants in it, refuses to acknowledge that the participants did contribute to something that happened, something valuable at least, and therefore sees the current practitioners of Bharatanatyam as pernicious. And so the debate, rather than being an open-minded, complex and dialogic one that is empathetic and seeks mutual understanding, is instead at the moment one that is it's reductive. It traps people in their caste and class identities rather than encouraging them to transcend those barriers, and it refuses to seek any sort of reconciliation between these two polarized standpoints on this very complex issue, or rather a very complex set of issues of acknowledgement of history, of appropriation, of ownership of culture, of the layered role of class and gender and so on. And I think, I mean, if I think about it, this is precisely why Maha and I started Re-cognising Dance, is because we found that the present debate lacked something, lacked balance, it lacked a third way of possibly looking at this situation, and it lacked a way to move ahead, because we're just, if both sides are just going to be accusing each other and fighting with each other the entire time, then what is going to happen with what's going to happen in the future? We have to find ways to dialogue across social barriers and dialogue across academic disagreements, and see what the future holds. Maha and I want, well, that's what we hope for every day, that Re-cognising Dance will be our small contribution to making the dance world more open-minded and more inclusive and more dialogic and more reflexive, and to avoid these sort of polarized discourses, and have this, the spirit of learning and mutual understanding to flourish. So that's what I have to say about the current debate.
Thank you. Maha, do you want to add something on this? And maybe at this point, you can tell the whole audience something a bit more about Re-cognising Dance, because you've mentioned it several times, but maybe it's a good time to explain to everyone who's maybe didn't know it.
Maha, you go.
So Re-cognising Dance, Aranyani and I found it sometime in June last year. When we started this, it was purely because of the kind of social media polarization and controversies that were happening. And we wished, if not for nothing, that people begin to read, And we actually first started with curating a database. We started making a database of, okay, if there is a student of dance who wants to know this, what should they do? Because most of us don't. When I started reading, we had very limited resources, and it was that I didn't have access to these academic resources, right? So there was very little I could learn, and of course the books I read, I'm grateful and thankful to them. It started as that, but then we realized, why not we bring these scholars who've written these books to talk to an audience who's otherwise shy to approach them, probably, or otherwise hesitant to read. Some of our initiatives, we know of people having read the books after, although we encourage people to read before they come for the discussion. A lot of them are motivated to read after. So recognizing dance began because of this, just purely because of the social media polarization. Over like a call with Aranyani, I said, why don't we do something that, I mean, there's always so much to be unhappy about in the world, but what can we do? What is our contribution to this? And so we started it off like that, and we're really thankful that so many scholars so willingly come to our platform, and so many people are willing to learn. Like, we're very happy that all our events are very well attended, and so many, which also shows that people are interested in learning, and we are just the moderators, and we're providing that platform for the say. As we say, we are an extremely strive to be a safe space for dialogue. uh, we do encourage disagreements. I mean, because that is when you have dialogues and discussions. But we are particularly not fond of disrespect and polarization and attacking each other on our platform. So our space serves to be a safe space for dialogue. But now we are trying to go beyond only history to other aspects of dance. We do a series called Discouraged, where we discuss contemporary issues in dance. And we also like to add, we're going beyond Bharatanatyam. We started off as, we are Bharatanatyam dancers, and we started off doing history around Devadasis of the South, but now we're trying to go beyond, and our subsequent events are around Odissi, and we did events on Kathak, and our discussions in the Discouraged series has participants from other art forms, and we try to be very inclusive, as inclusive as we can. Yeah. Aranyani, anything else?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, so Maha has explained in great detail what the flesh of recognizing dance is. I'm just going to quickly give you the skeletal structure, which is that it's an online platform. What we basically do are events where we invite people to come and speak on Zoom. And actually speak is not necessarily the appropriate term. We invite them to interact with the viewers and to interact with us. What sets us apart, I think, from other platforms is that we don't invite people to come and give a lecture or to give a speech or a talk. It's more about the content of their work is already read by Mahalakshmi and me, and then we ask questions to her or him, or the speaker, and then after that, very quickly, we ask a very small amount of questions, and we quickly open it out to the viewers, so that the viewers can have direct interaction with the speakers, whether they are scholars or whether they are practitioners or whether they are young dancers or whether they are art historians or anything. And I think the other thing I'd like to say was, just to say that all of our interactions happen on Zoom, and this is something that we've discovered is one of the things about the pandemic that we really took advantage of is that since it is all online, we went to the moon and back to kind of spread awareness about this platform across borders. So we try to keep the events at a time that as many time zones can attend. And so it's not just a platform that's limited to Indian audiences. It is something that Anna, you were there on one of our events, or not more than one of our events. Yeah. So, that's what I think we really understood. Recognizing dance as a platform where we can break those barriers and, dialogue across barriers, dialogue across borders. So yeah, we're very excited and we're very proud of the platform, actually. Yeah.
Yes, and you should be. It's a really great platform. So to end, I would like to have a reflection from both of you about how can we as dance students or dancers look ahead while honoring the past, this complex history that we have. I don't know, that I have asked you about actually. So how do you think that we can look ahead?
So, Anna, before I actually answer that part of the question, there's one very important thing that I want to highlight, that in the entire controversy around Devadasi and the discourse, we kind of reduce dance history to just that. And we don't look at dance history beyond this, right? Because dance history is a significant amount of dance history is contributed by these kings that I spoke about. They were prolific writers, they were poets, right? There were so many composers, there were so many Natuvanars. So there are so many important aspects of dance history that also have to be honored and studied in our discourse of dance history. So I'd like to begin on that note. So the question about honoring the past and looking ahead. First, let me talk about looking ahead. I firmly believe we do have to look ahead. Uh, I uh, I really believe art will evolve, if not for me, if not for today, from with somebody else. It will change. Evolve is not the word. Art is bound to change to the sensibilities of the society, of the people then, and so on. So that we will have to look ahead. Art has to move. About honoring the past, one of the important thing I think is acknowledging that there is an alternative aesthetic. Today, our understanding of Bharatanatyam is that we have a very rigid understanding, right? That some certain kinds of dance is perfect and certain kinds of dance isn't. A certain understanding of posture, certain aramandi, certain kind of costumes, certain, we have this angles, lines. These are the terms that we use all the time. And we need to acknowledge, to honor the past, we need to acknowledge that there is another aesthetic, and that other aesthetic is, there are performers of the other aesthetic even today, and we need to acknowledge and respect that. And I think this is one way of us honoring the past. The other thing is, already what I said, is to read everything that you can catch hold of. And like I also said, Natya Shastra is an important part of dance history. The Abhinay Darpana is an important part of dance history. So it's important for us to read everything and come to an informed understanding. And you need to get that for yourself. And which is what we are probably trying to facilitate through recognizing dance. But you have to spend quality time reading history to acknowledge and honor history. And the other very, very important aspect I think we have to do today is to teach this history. This has to come to our curriculums in dance schools. Just as we have Abhinay Darpana, just as we have all the shlokas that we study, they are as important, but we need to bring this into our mainstream dance curriculum. And this is a very important aspect, I think, to honor the past.
Well, I mean, I can only just add to what Maha said. I completely agree with everything that you said. And I think actually this question of how, as dancers or dance students, can we look ahead while honoring the past? I think this is a central question for our generation of dancers. You know, because as Maha said, it is very important to look ahead because dance is not a static entity. So it is bound to change. It is bound to, and it should adapt uh, to the changing times. It cannot be. I firmly believe this, that nothing should be preserved, and kind of like, actually, Chandralekha, the legendary dancer Chandralekha, she talked about this, and I completely agree with her. She talked about the fossilization of dance forms, and that dance forms are not things to be fossilized and preserved and kept in museums. Uh, they do evolve, and if you don't want to use the word evolve, because yes, evolve has this kind of connotation that it's changing for the better, doesn't necessarily change for the better. But change is inevitable, it's going to happen, and I think it needs to, that the fact that we are going to change, that dance is going to change in the future, is something that we must embrace. But again, as Maha said, it is equally important to understand what the past is and to honor it. And yes, I completely agree with Maha. I'm just reiterating everything that you're saying, that the way to acknowledge the past is to we keep talking about this: know your history. Don't go into these the convenient stories of don't hide behind the mythology and the spirituality and all of that, that we are kind of, that Indian classical dance, not just Bharatanatyam, Indian classical dance on the whole is plagued by this whole idea of what classical is and what spiritual is, and what and how great art, ancient tradition is, and all this whole glorified idea of what our classical dance forms are. We need to acknowledge the reality. We need to acknowledge and yeah, the different aesthetic, and not judge the different aesthetic by today's aesthetic standards. And again, this is all a part of being inclusive. Both aesthetics are valid, and they both can exist side by side if we stop battling, to say this is the better one or this is the better one. Why? There is space for inclusivity. We just have to switch on a switch in our brains to say that yes, it's okay, you can have that and you can also have this. You can honor the past and still practice a modern form of Bharatanatyam. You can be Latin American and still do Odissi or Bharatanatyam, and it's not appropriation. All of those things, we need to come out of these traps, and that's how I think we will acknowledge the past and look ahead. And I think recognizing dance is one of the ways that Maha and I at least are hoping that we try to do both.
Well, what can I say? Thank you very much. This was so much information and very interesting, and you're both very clear when you explain all these very difficult subjects. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anna. It was a pleasure. It was an absolute pleasure to talk to you, and it was a pleasure to kind of revisit these questions that we constantly revisit in recognizing dance anyway. But we are usually the ones asking questions, so it was interesting to be on the other side of the, yeah.
Well, great.
I'd like to add.
Yes, Maha.
Very interesting. This is one of the first times I'm speaking about this, and I was hesitant because I'm not a scholar. Neither is Aranyani in that sense, although she has written a thesis. She's a very good writer, but we are not scholars. So
Yeah, we're not small.
We can do this. We are practitioners of Bharatanatyam, and we continue to be practitioners of Bharatanatyam, and this is something we're doing on the side, right? And this is important for the community to understand that it has. If we are here today, we are not scholars. We are one among you. We are we are also trying to understand. So it's important for us to engage with this, and not just, this shouldn't be in academics and in the bookshelves.
Yeah. Oh my God. Now I also want to say something to this,
Yes.
because
Yes, of
you're
course.
so right. You're so right, Maha. Because
I'm still
actually,
recording, so.
all right, yeah. I mean, there is a difference between scholarship and practice, and I think, and again, both are very valuable and valid professions, and they're both needed for a comprehensive understanding of dance. But I think the fact that we are not scholars and we are practitioners, I think is something that's important, because I think that's what we need. We need more practitioners in touch with scholarship, and we need, I think, perhaps more scholars in touch with the practice, because we need to bridge that gap also between scholarship and practice, because it is very different to write a book about dance if you don't practice dance, because you don't embody it in the sense that practitioners do. And at the same time, it's very different to kind of it's very different to actually embody what scholars talk about in your everyday life and everyday practice. So uh, there is also this constant kind of, I feel it, I don't know if it's very vocalized, but there is this kind of tug of war between scholarship and practice also that's constantly happening. And that's just yet another bridge that we need to, I mean, another gap that we need to bridge.
Well, yes, totally. And that's why we thought of you and not of scholars to make this, to have this conversation with, because I think we as dancers or dance students, we all ask ourselves the same questions, and maybe we've learned the things we have to unlearn and relearn in the same way somehow. Even in India, in Latin America, wherever we studied, we all had the first like history, which is now we want to unlearn, relearn. So I think that's different. The approach we have as students or dancers is different that though the approach that a scholar has. So, well, thank you.
Thank you so much.
I stopped the recording.
For instance, right? Do you think that all these 8 art forms are being classified in 8 movements somehow let this I don't know if the term is evolution, as you mentioned, evolve is it's difficult to be said, but at least here in Latin America, we received the information that the movement that is somehow fixed things, that it doesn't have any other influential movements that may change the repertory, the technique. So do you think that fixing the art in 8 movements itself may let other things influence? Yes, I don't know if it's is it clear? Sorry, I don't know how can I say it in English.
Maha, do you want to say something?
No, so the boxing of dances as classical and folk itself did not exist. Is one of, and when again I go back to Sadar in Bharatanatyam's history, it had a lot of folk influence in terms of music, and the music that was used for Sadar was never called classical music or so I'm not sure. The only thing I'd like to importantly say here was there was no rigid difference between what was called classical and what was not, and it was again during the revival and reconstruction that we classicized and Sanskritized dance. Aranyani, Dr. Ashya has made the valid comment if you'd like to.
Yeah. Actually, Dr. Asha Sethi is also here. She made a comment on this, and I've just recently written an article on Rukmini Devi that kind of touches upon this a little bit, on how the Kalakshetra model kind of became these are Dr. Adya Kaktikar's words, that the Kalakshetra model kind of became the blueprint for other classical dance forms to become classical. So in that sense, the Kalakshetra model, the pedagogic model, the presentation of the Margam style of Alari Pujati, a longer presentation with as opposed to, for example, in Odissi used to be the entire performance used to be 20 to 25 minutes, and then following the Kalakshetra model, it became longer. It became much more structured with with the 5 distinctive pieces from start to finish in that particular order. And the teaching method, the replacement of the one-on-one guru shishya teaching into an institutionalized kind of education system, that is also borrowed from the Kalakshetra model. And also the introduction of dance dramas, the costumes. There's various levels, and this has not just happened with Odissi. This has apparently happened with various with the other dance forms that are called classical today as well. But I have to say that classical is something that I think we all need to kind of question today. Particularly because there was another place where I was reading this, and I can't remember where, but that the term classical is something that we've borrowed from the West, from classical ballet. Before that, there was no such thing as classical versus non-classical. It was just it was all just dance forms, and they all had their particular functions. Bharatanatyam had a ritual function in the temples, and there are certain folk dances that have social functions. There are dance forms that are in certain cultures in India, you actually do dances during a funeral procession. So there was no hierarchy as such until quite recently, when now classical dance forms are like up there, and there are only 8, and everyone is trying to aspire to get to that classical status, because once you get to that classical status, that's when you get recognized by the government organizations. That's when you get patronage, that's when you get funding, and that sort of thing. So even this whole classical business is quite political and politicized. I don't know if that answers your question.
Since some of you are Kuchipudi dancers as well, I'm not sure I should be speaking for Kuchipudi, but I speak as an observer. Kuchipudi again was essentially a group, a drama, a form of theater before it became, and today we practice it as a solo. It is, and that again, I was just discussing this with Aranyani when she had written her article, that not Odissi, of course, we know of Odissi having strong influence because of, and Odissi adopting Abhinaya Darpana, right, into their pedagogy. But Kuchipudi having become a solo form, and identifying items to form something that mimics a margam or a 1 hour solo presentation is also very interesting. And since you're all Kuchipudi dancers, you should probably think about, some of you are Kuchipudi dancers because I saw, you should think about that as well, because Kuchipudi was originally a theater, and it was post-classicization and the need to having a solo form. Yeah.
Well, thanks a lot. There's lots of questions about material in Spanish or Portuguese, or if you know about some films, or that people who are not fluent in English could access. So what I want to thank you so much, Mahalakshmi and Aranyani. All this information is not easy to get for us in South America, and I think you've given us, you've left us with more questions. I think everybody is feeling the same. I feel like I have now a lot of questions, of new questions, and I could keep speaking with you like for hours, as I told you before. So it's really a great pleasure to have you here. Your insights were really very, very interesting. So what can I say? Thanks a lot. It's really an honor for us to have you here. Les estoy agradeciendo, diciéndoles que para nosotros acceder a esta información desde América Latina muchas veces es difícil, no sabemos por dónde empezar, y creo que ellas nos dieron como un panorama muy amplio y muy interesante y muy claro de cómo están las discusiones sobre estos temas, y que de alguna manera nos dejan con más preguntas. Por lo menos lo que yo siento es que realmente nos quedaron más preguntas, y me parece que surgió mucho interés, así que bueno, las invito también a seguirlas a ellas en sus redes con toda la información que nos dan. So if you want to say something, I leave it to you.
Well, I just wanted to say thank you so much for inviting us to come here and to speak with all of you and to interact with all of you. It's been a huge honor for us as well, and the interview itself was quite an enlightening experience for Maha and me as well, because like I said in the interview, we're usually the ones asking the questions, so it was nice to be it was interesting to be on the other side of actually having to answer questions. And it kind of made us, it challenged us to re-articulate our thoughts and rethink some of the things that we were talking about and engaging with. So thank you so much. And thank you so much, all of you, for attending and listening to our answers. And I'd just like to end by saying very quickly that if you have any questions, unfortunately, I don't think we have an answer for you regarding whether there are books or things available in your languages. Actually, finding resources on dance, it's a huge challenge for even English-speaking countries and English-speaking practitioners and scholars, because dance resources are just really, really hard to come by. Dance books are either very expensive, they're unaffordable, or they're not available, or many of them are out of print. The films are also, some of them are very, very, very old and very bad quality, and so it is a challenge for all of us. But Maha has just posted our email in the chat box. Please feel free to write to us if you have any questions. We are there to help to collect resources, gather them, put you in touch with scholars, answer any of your questions. We don't have all the answers, but whatever questions we do have, whatever answers we do have, we would love to share them with you. And if we don't have answers to the questions, we might know people who do, so we can connect you with them. So please feel free to reach out to us, follow us on Facebook, follow our YouTube channel. There'll be a lot of information available there that might already answer some of your questions. That's all I'd like to say. Thank you so much, Anna. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Anna.
Please let me just translate what Aranyani said, just 1 second, for non-English speakers. Aranyani, además de, agradecerles a todos por haber estado acá y haber escuchado las respuestas a las preguntas que les hicimos, nos dice que, les generó un desafío estar del lado de quienes responden las preguntas y no quienes las hacen, que es lo que hacen habitualmente en su espacio. Y ahí Mahalakshmi dejó el mail de Re-cognising Dance y les pide que si tienen dudas sobre la posibilidad de conseguir fuentes sobre estos temas, les escriban, porque esas no tienen todas las respuestas, pero probablemente conozcan a gente que las pueden guiar para conseguir esas respuestas, y que es un trabajo que están haciendo, ¿no? Recopilar fuentes sobre el tema. Please, Maha, yes.
I think, I just wanted to say, Aranyani has said it all. Thank you so much. But I just wanted to say, all the history we're talking about is not Indian history, it's Bharatanatyam history, and hence it's all our history. It's not India, and it's not Indian history, it's our history now. Bharatanatyam is global, and it's all our history. And I'm so glad you've taken your step in learning your history and taking this step. So we are glad to help you in this journey. We are students as well, so we are glad to help you. Reach out to us whenever. We're always there. Thank you.
So nice, Maha, thank you. Lo que decía Mahalakshmi es que la historia de la que estamos hablando no es la historia de India, es la historia del Bharatanatyam y de la danza en particular. Entonces es nuestra historia, incluyéndonos a nosotros también en esa historia, porque no es solo de India, sino de quienes practicamos estas danzas. Así que está muy contenta de que estemos iniciando este camino, interesadas, interesados en iniciar el camino de entender nuestra historia. So, thank you so much, and we'll certainly keep in touch and have more activities together. Lots of people were there today, so thank you, thank you. Muchas gracias a todas por haber participado y bueno, los invito a seguir con las actividades de hoy, que ahora siguen con un taller de Odissi y después con un montón de otras actividades. So everyone, there's lots of more workshops and activities today, so if you want to join us, please be welcome. So bye, thank you so much. Thank you, have a nice day, bye. Gracias.
Thank you.
Gracias, yes.
Gracias.
Gracias, muchas gracias. Adiós.